Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. Today's guest is Writers of the Future winner, Rustin Lovewell. Welcome, Rustin.
Hi, John. Good to be here.
And first of all, I guess congratulations on being a winner.
I never get told hearing that. That's great.
Great. So how did you first find out about the contest?
So I first found out about Writers of the Future at a small con called ReaderCon in Massachusetts, where a former winner, Nydia Okorafor, was the guest of honor. And the person sitting next to me mentioned that to me. And I thought I should really check out this contest if it's producing winners of such a caliber. And that was, I guess, 2 years ago. And I'm here.
Good. So you've entered how many times?
So amazingly, this was my first time entering.
Wow.
So even on your first time, it's possible.
So what's been your journey as a writer?
So I've only started writing maybe 6 years ago. It started as a hobby for me. I'm also a scientist, so it was a way to kind of decompress after being in the lab all day, something I found very cathartic. In more recent years, I started taking it more seriously, thinking about publications, thinking about contests such as Writers of the Future. And I happened to have the right story ready at the right time for an entry into the contest, and it worked out very well.
That's awesome. So what do you see as the connection between your scientific background and science? Like what is your scientific background?
Yeah, so I'm an immunologist. I study the interactions between our immune system and pathogens. And I wish I had a more satisfying answer for how that translated into being a fantasy writer, which is what I like to write. I find both aspects of, I guess, of science and of writing, crazy magical systems interesting. Why do we care if a certain character lives or dies? Even if that character is not real. And that emotional response is something that I find really fascinating. Mm-hmm. Just like I find, how a bacterium will subvert our immune system and cause an infection. That's something I find very fascinating. And so it's born out of my interest and things I find, interesting and want to learn more about. Studying the human immune system is something that I find endlessly interesting, and seeing how people react to my stories is something I find endlessly interesting, and I think that's where the two meet for me.
Good. So tell me about your story.
So I wrote a story called Release from Service. It's a fantasy story about a young man who's apprenticed to an assassin, and he has a crisis of conscience when he is forced to kill a child, and it's a very twisty, turvy story that is exactly the type of story I like to write, one where you don't know what's going to happen next, and the ending might surprise you.
I can guarantee it will surprise you. It's a great, great story.
Well, thank you.
So, how did your life story go to becoming an author from being a scientist? Did it have an earlier beginning? Was a writer
So I've been an avid reader my whole life, for sure. I always reading something, usually in the science fiction fantasy bent, though not always. And as a postdoctoral fellow and as a scientist, I used writing as a way to decompress, to kind of relax my mind. And it's something that I kind of fell in love with and started taking more seriously and doing, studying craft and looking at stories more as, instead of just as entertainment, but how did the author do this? How did the author, make me have this emotional reaction towards a character, and can I recapitulate that in my own way? And that's kind of what led me to this point where I, took a story that I had written, and then I rewrote it, and I rewrote it, and I rewrote it, and when I felt it was ready, I submitted it, and it brought me here, which is great.
It's totally great. So, do you have any particular heroes or major influencers?
I mean, certainly several. There's some the author influencers are Neil Gaiman, Brent Weeks, Brandon Sanderson. Those are the big fantasy authors who I certainly look up to, and my work is certainly influenced highly by them. But then there's also people in my life that have influenced my work, my family, certainly. When I was writing Release from Service about this concept of killing a child, I was thinking about what is something that scares me the most. like losing my child is something that scares me the most. And so that's what I tried to capture in that story. And so that was a major influence on how that story came about. So certainly there's some big name authors there, but also the people, my friends and family that have certainly crafted how I look at the world and what comes out of my work.
Got it. So now had you read any of the Rise of the Future books before?
So I've had read several of them. For once I heard about the contest, I went and bought several of them and read through a bunch of the stories there and was so impressed with them. I mean, there's such good stories in there. Some by authors I'd heard of and some I had not yet heard of. And, it would certainly help me hone my story into what would fit into that format.
Good, because that's one of the things I'm curious about is, what do you see would be advice or tips you could offer to the aspiring writer?
Yeah, so I look at writing as a similar skill as learning to ski or learning to play golf. I mean, when you start, you suck, and I was not good. My first stories were awful. The first novel I wrote was this big 120,000 word epic fantasy that had just every trope imaginable. It had dragons and talking swords, and I think at one point I had all my heroes sitting around like a pot of stew talking. And with practice, I recognized that trope isn't going to work, and my craft got better. And that came from sitting in the chair and typing. Just like learning to ski, it hurts the first couple times down the mountain, but in time you figure it out, and that's what it takes. It takes time and practice.
Yeah, a writer writes.
Yeah.
In one of the classes that Owen Hubbard, when he taught at, I think he taught at Harvard, and it was a creative writing class, and he went there because he was like at the top of the field back at that point in the 40s, and he told him, just throw away your first 100,000 words.
Yeah.
And they were just like aghast because they were spending a whole semester to do their 6,000 word short story.
Yeah. And it's hard to do that, that's part of learning to be your own editor and to recognize, that this doesn't work, even though I put so much time and effort into it, it's not what's best for the story. And I think that, again, comes with practice and recognizing what works and what doesn't and why.
Yeah. So what do you see as your future now? Because you've got your science, you still have your science career that you're doing. So how does writing, do you see it in the future?
So I love to do both, and I want to continue doing both. And I think that's feasible in the current way of things. A lot of professional authors also have second careers, and that's kind of the way I would like to go. I'd like to continue writing and continue being a scientist and putting out my work and chasing down both avenues. Good.
So now, what kind of advice do you have to offer to the aspiring writer?
Well, beyond just practicing, don't let fear of rejection stop you from putting your stuff out there. You will almost certainly be rejected. I was rejected. Those big authors I just listed were all rejected at some point. It's going to happen, and don't let it discourage you. Just keep practicing.
Great. Thank you very much. I look forward to reading wherever you got to come through. And in the meantime, have a great week this week.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rustin. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for our next installment of the Writers of the Future podcast. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to new and amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy.